We're fast approaching a year since Russia invaded Ukraine and unleashed a wave of violence. Since then, conversations about holding Russia accountable for waging an unprovoked war are gaining steam. There are a few options that the international community is currently considering against Russia. The first one looks at whether the invasion of Ukraine was lawful to begin with, what's known as a crime of aggression under international law. Dubbed the mother of all crimes, that offense is committed when one country attacks another without justification. The International Criminal Court is the usual vehicle for pursuing such claims, but not in this case because Russia isn't a member of the International Criminal Court, which is why an alternative special tribunal is being proposed at the United Nations level. The idea of an independent tribunal received a boost last week when the head of the EU Commission backed the proposal. If launched, the tribunal would allow for the first international criminal trial on aggressions of the war since the aftermath of World War II. The second path for holding Russia's perpetrators of war criminally accountable has to do with investigating war crimes that have been committed during this conflict. Now, this is an area where the ICC does have the authority to investigate both Russia and Ukraine, since these prosecutions only require Ukraine's consent, regardless of whether or not Russia is a member of the ICC. War crimes include summary executions, torture, using starvation as a weapon, deploying banned weapons, and deliberately attacking civilian targets, which brings us to Russia's targeted attacks on Ukraine's power grid. For nearly 2 months now, Russia's been pounding Ukraine's energy grid, at one point leaving more than 10 million Ukrainians without electricity or heat, just as winter arrives and temperatures drop below zero. Almost half of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been destroyed, and millions of people across the country face daily blackouts. The U.S. and Amnesty International have called the attacks a war crime. Russia's formally denied intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure and depicts the attacks as, quote, legitimate military targets. But even when an object can be deemed a legitimate military target, there are, in fact, still limits on legally how it can be attacked. With more on this, I'm joined by Oona Hathaway. She's a professor of international law at Yale Law School, former special counsel for the Department of Defense. She's just returned from a trip to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where she made the case for the creation of an international tribunal to prosecute Russia. Professor Hathaway, good to see you. Thank you for being with us again.
Thank you for having me.
You and I had lots of conversations in February and March about the things that back then looked like war crimes that Russia was committing in Ukraine. Much has changed since then, including the targeting of civilian power infrastructure. Can you tell me how you think about this? There's power infrastructure in Lviv, which is very, very far from the front lines, in Kyiv, far from the sort of the actual battle lines between Ukraine and Russia, and these are affecting civilians. How do we think about this when Russia says those are legitimate military targets?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, it's very clear that Russia is not doing what it's legally required to do, which is distinguish between military targets and civilians. This is one of the fundamental obligations of international humanitarian law. It's called the principle of distinction. And Russia has been violating it left and right, targeting infrastructure that is fundamental to civilians, that allows them not just electricity, it's essential to managing hospitals, to ensuring that people are able to stay warm during the winter. And these have clearly been targets, direct targets of Russian military operations.
What were you arguing for at The Hague? What was the conversation about a tribunal to look into these things, and how is that different from the normal course of prosecuting war crimes?
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we face with the International Criminal Court is it has jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, but it does not have jurisdiction over the core crime, the crime of launching this illegal war in the first place, which is called the crime of aggression. Because Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute that creates the International Criminal Court, that one crime cannot be brought against Russia, against Russians, against Putin, against Lavrov, against any of the leaders of the Russian government. And so in order to charge them for this fundamental crime, the crime of aggression, you have to create a new tribunal, a special tribunal to try the crime of aggression. And so there's an effort underway to do that, to create this new court for this purpose. It would be narrowly focused on the crime of aggression. And the conversation now is how exactly to do that, where to center it, who's going to pay for it. There's a lot of details still to be worked out.
Where is the United States on this, and does that matter?
Well, the United States has not come out with a clear position, which is in a way a good thing. It has not come out strongly in favor. It also has not come out against it. And in some ways, that's kind of the best of all worlds for the United States to sort of stay out of the conversation. The U.S. is not a party to the International Criminal Court. It participates in the meetings as an observer, but not as a party to the court. And I think it's best if other nations take the lead on this for now. But the U.S. can really be supportive by, in a sense, staying out of the conversation, indicating a willingness to see the court created, and let other countries, European countries, let Africa and African countries take an important role in making this decision, rather than it necessarily coming from the United States.
And part of that, just the context for my viewers who might be saying, why wouldn't we want the United States to take a strong position? And that is, as you and I have discussed, the United States has not always been where some of my viewers would think the right place is on this thing. They often, like in the example I just cited with the investigation into the death of Shireen Abu Akleh, take a strong position that the ICC shouldn't be involved.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. has not always been the biggest fan of international justice. It put in place sanctions against judges and people who were responsible for running the International Criminal Court when the ICC undertook an investigation of U.S. abuses in Afghanistan. And certainly we're hearing calls from those who say, why are we creating a special court here for Ukraine? But no one has ever looked into the possible illegality of the war in Iraq. And so there's concerns about double standards. And so the United States, which has not always been on the right side of these questions, in some ways it's best for it to kind of step back and let others take the lead on this question about whether to create a special tribunal.
Professor Hathaway, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us. It's an important conversation that I think we're going to need to continue on a lot of fronts. Oona Hathaway is a professor of international law at the Yale Law School and a former special counsel for the Department of Defense.